Hello and welcome to episode 9 of the Inside Social Work podcast. I'm your host Marie Vakakis, and in today's episode I'll be chatting with Helen Gray about burnout. She shares some of her own personal stories and how she's developed an entire program dedicated to reducing burnout for social workers and other allied health professionals. There'll be some links in the show notes to her website and some of the details for her upcoming course. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and don't forget, if you find it interesting, please click subscribe and leave us a rating or a review. They're really important for me to help work out what's working, to get your feedback, and to make improvements to the show. So don't forget to rate the podcast wherever it is you get your podcast. Thank you. In today's episode, I interview Helen Gray. Originally from the UK, Helen studied social policy and politics at the University of Newcastle, Upton Tyne, and has a Masters of Social Work from the Queens University in Belfast in Northern Ireland. Helen's career has mainly been in the family and childcare arena, including statutory child protection in the heart of Belfast, where she worked with youth at risk of homelessness in Northern Ireland and in Sydney. She moved into a managerial role in an NGO in a family support and risk prevention program with families that had an ROSH reports made. In 2015, Helen experienced psychological breakdown as a result of burnout and the impact of vicarious trauma, and left her practicing social work career in mid-2016. Helen now has an emerging startup business with a focus on supporting practicing social workers to gain awareness, knowledge and skills to reduce the impact of vicarious trauma and burnout on their health and profession. Helen has a growing interest in the role moral resiliency, moral distress, and moral residue play in a social worker's career and well-being. Helen is launching a pilot of a specialised program, Because You Care, SOS, which stands for Save Our Social Work. The program, launched in August, provides online training and support to enable social workers to explore their well-being and the impact of their work. So, without further ado, I welcome Helen, where we talk about preventing burnout. Welcome, Helen.
Hi, thank you very much for having me here.
Thanks very much for joining us. This is such an interesting topic. And in a lot of the episodes so far, we've talked about burnout and looking after ourselves. So this is a really perfect topic, I guess, to get people familiar with some of these words, what they mean, and what they can do to prevent burnout later on in their career.
Absolutely. And it's great to be able to be out here and talking about it and getting the word out, I think, to both students, new graduates, and those who are further along in their career as well.
Wonderful. So could you share with the audience some of your social work journey? We had a little bit there in the bio, but what are some of the things that have led you to where you are now?
Okay, so look, I guess I go back to the beginning. I'm a daughter of two teachers. My father was a head teacher, my mum was a home economics teacher, and I grew up with the belief that the work you do is a vocation. I also grew up with the idea of a career for life and a very strong sense of social responsibility. I knew I didn't want to become a teacher, but for a long time I didn't know what I wanted to do. But that idea that my work was meant to be serving others and giving back to society was sown in from a very early age. So as you said, I initially kept my options really broad. I did social policy, politics, and psychology when I first started. But ironically, I dropped my psychology in the first year. I just found the brain too complex and confusing, which now, when that is a key part of my interest and my passion. So I find that that's quite amusing. But look, in terms of how I got into social work, I was heavily influenced by my early experiences. In Northern Ireland, I got involved as a university student, in a youth cross-community community relations program. And that eventually drew me to moving to Northern Ireland probably back in about 1994. And it was a great place to be doing the hard work, doing the grassroots community relations, community work. And after a while, I did a couple of those usual stints. I worked in a youth refuge. I worked homeless accommodations, and I got some work in an accommodation service called a foyer, which was a new model being set up in Northern Ireland, and it was supporting youth at risk as long as they were engaging in education and training. And that was really what decided me on the fact that I needed to go and get my professional social work qualifications. So I went back to do a master's of social work and did my training. And when I came out, popped out the other end of that qualification, all ready to face the world, as they say, I started working in statutory child protection in the heart of Belfast. So that really was a baptism of fire into social work. I mean, we all know the experience of people coming out as new graduates and taking those jobs in, child protection in facts or in social services as it was over there. And you either sink or swim. I was exposed very quickly to the dark humor of social work, which has always been something that, keeps us going as a profession. But I also was just caught up with the doing. I rapidly did some post qualifications, and after about three and a half years, I was at a point where I was just like, I'm not sure what I want to do here, and so I decided to take a career break. A bit of a luxury, but my social workers were in need in Northern Ireland, so they gave me a year off, and I went travelling, and I ended up in Australia. And unfortunately for them, that's where I've stayed. And in Australia, really, I have again found myself working in that child and family arena. I've done a lot of work with youth at risk of homelessness. And I started work with a youth foundation, which became very important in my identity and my professional career. And whilst funding decisions meant that the accommodation model, which was similar to that I started in Northern Ireland years ago, the foyer model, whilst that closed down due to funding issues, I stayed involved in the youth foundation for a long time. I became a director on the board and a working director with that youth foundation until eventually we closed that foundation back in 2012. And after that, I returned back, I guess, to my roots of working in family support, the edge of child protection. It was a managerial role that I thought was going to be quite an innovative program, working outside the realms of statutory social work. And in the end, I guess it resulted in me being drawn very much back into that statutory child protection field. So I worked there with a team for a number of years, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But that's where I actually then came to the end of my professional career in um, 2015, when I experienced my episode of burnout.
That's an incredible story and such a wide range of experience. I can see why you would say baptism of fire for those who've worked in those industries. It is huge.
It is.
You get thrown in the deep end as a graduate. Often graduates take those roles, which is, I guess, one of our main audiences here at the podcast. And it's overwhelming. It's exciting. There's a lot of change. There's political change. There's government change. There's funding cuts. There's high risk young people that you work with, or children and families, and it's just everything happening all at once.
And that's right. And I think, we were so excited that we're doing the real work after our study, that we do just immerse ourselves in it. And I know for me, it was a couple of years of completely, having my eyes opened and my mind blown by the experiences that I had to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But Northern Ireland itself was a very traumatized society due to its long history of troubles and sectarianism. That working there really was quite pivotal in terms of, I think, my later experiences, because of the influences that I guess I didn't realize at the time, but how I'd internalized them and how they'd impacted me.
Yeah, that's it's a hard thing to understand. So I guess rewinding a little bit for those who are kind of new to the field, and we hear burnout thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean? What is burnout?
Look, I think that burnout is a really popular phrase at the moment, especially the World Health Organization, this year recently reclassified it as an occupational phenomenon. And I think that's reignited the focus of what it means and how it impacts individuals in their working lives. When I was going through my experience of burnout, I guess I didn't know what it was. And I think that is really important to understand, because a lot of us don't know that we are experiencing some of the signs and symptoms of burnout. We don't understand what it is that we're experiencing, and I think often we think that it's to do with us. It's an individual deficit, and I think that it's really important that that's not the case, and it's seen as something which is actually, the impact of our work is the work that we do as social workers is undeniably going to have an impact on us. There's no question about that. I think it's the challenge is making sure that we manage that impact and we're supported to manage that impact. And one of the things that I've become very clear on is that doing the work we love should not make us ill. It's as simple as that. So look, burnout is, it's been conceptualized as a syndrome that is resulting from chronic workplace stress that's not being successfully managed. And I think it's easy again with that phrase to start associating blame. Is that, oh, it's not being successfully managed by me as the individual, it's my fault? Or in the other way, it's not been successfully managed by the organization, it's all their fault. And I think we need to be careful we need to try and neutralize the idea of where the challenges have come, and not be trying to proportion blame, but really look at how collectively we can work to prevent the outcomes of burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned it's a collection of symptoms. What are some of the symptoms? So some of the things that come to mind look very similar to almost a combination of anxiety and depression. So you have that kind of worry and that feeling maybe in your chest or in your body. That can be low mood or irritability, really affecting your productivity. And like you said, often it can seep into your personal life or at home. So you're not quite sure what it is. You just
That's right. And I think, that idea that, burnout is not a medical condition. So we don't get diagnosed. When I had my breakdown, I didn't get diagnosed with burnout. I got diagnosed with a major depressive disorder as a result of my situation, you know, code name for burnout. But it can have those impacts across the gamut. And I think when we start seeing it in our work, it's almost when it's getting to be too late. um, so, that idea of, like you talk about increasing irritability, being that a building sense of, anger or resentment or frustration with things that are happening around you. I remember in the run up, my daughter, who I think was 7 at the time, she said to a friend of mine, she said, "Mummy can't do click and collect at Woolworths because she gets too upset with the workers when they get the order wrong." And I was like, wow. And I didn't think anything of it, but when I reflected back, in the time afterwards, and looked back at how my stress and anxiety and the situation at work was impacting my personal life, it was little things like that. So it's things like either withdrawing, or separating yourself, distancing yourself from some of your personal relationships. It is things like that sense of exhaustion and energy depletion. So, the World Health Organization says that that's one of the key criteria, is that exhaustion and energy depletion. And I think that that's something that can start to play out. You might stop doing some of the things that you've normally done for your self-care and wellness, and you end up just trying to get through the day. They also talk about it being, that sense of distancing yourself from your job, or having that negativity and that criticism, cynicism about your work. And I think that comes, different people internalize that in different ways. So, I internalized it inwards, that I wasn't doing the job, I wasn't able to do what was needed to be done. Other people might, project that outwards to the systems or the society. But also, again, that reduced sense of personal efficacy, that idea that you just aren't able to do the things that you believed you should do. And I think with social workers, because we are in many ways a very ethic driven, we have our philosophies, we have our beliefs, and about what we should be doing, what we're trying to create, this sense of greater good. And those things can start to play really, really deeply on the inner psyche, that idea that you're no longer effective in what you're doing. So yeah, so I mean, I think the symptoms of burnout, it might be, they mirror those, or they all blend into one with those of compassion fatigue, not being able to sleep, that restlessness, all of those aspects. It might be that you're overeating or you're undereating. You might be compensating in other ways. The odd glass of wine becomes a couple of glasses of wine. We're trying to do our sort of like our numbing and our coping strategies. So there's a lot of ways that impacts on the personal and the professional.
I found it interesting when you said you internalize it. I can see how it can go almost in a couple of different ways of, like yourself, where you just said, it's me, I'm not doing a good enough job, I'm not competent enough, or I've missed something, or to the other extreme where it's like, it's their fault, it's the clients, it's the organization, and you just kind of, you show up, you're very kind of disassociated and disconnected, and then, you find your tasks quite mind-numbing and repetitive, or underwhelming or overwhelming. So it kind of, it can flip, and it's really interesting when it's, you want to kind of know your baseline of where's your normal, and deviations from that is kind of a bit of an indication maybe something's not quite right.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people who use that as a coping mechanism. And that sense of, well, I'll just do enough. I'll just go through the motions. I just have to keep doing, just enough to get me through. And that can actually be, a very clear sign that people are suffering, because it's that coping motion. It's almost giving up, being resigned to the fact that you're not going to be able to do the grand things that you envisioned you once could, and just like you say, stepping through the motions. And then many other people actually, and it's a very common factor that many other, especially in our profession of social workers, increase the workload. So the idea that actually, well, we need to keep doing more. So I'm not going to take time off. I'm going to work longer hours. I'm not going to take my holiday. And so those things are both indicators. There might be somebody taking too much leave or more than the average leave. It may be an indicator that something is wrong, but also those workers who just, refuse to take leave and keep charging on and are doing more than the hours, that may be a case of, that they're actually trying to fight those demons inside that they need to be able to do this job better.
Yeah, so it sounds like we can break it up into, we've talked about some of like the physical signs, so that's your changes in appetite, you mentioned sleep, feeling tired and lethargic are quite common things there, and then that sort of emotional sign of feeling, I think you mentioned that self-doubt and failure, maybe a helplessness and being defeated a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that idea of a loss of hope, um, a loss of belief in the effectiveness or the potential effectiveness of the work that you do, an increased sense of risk and anxiety about the work, either about, are you going to be able to keep this work? Are you going to be able to keep doing the work? Or, the risks and the the challenges in the work are just ever mounting, and there seems to be no answer. So again, I think there's no one. We as social workers, we should be used to that, but there is no one set, way that this plays out for people. Everybody's journey is very individual, and I think that's where we do need to be able to take that time to look inwards at our own needs and see how that impacts us.
So what would be some of the signs that you would notice in yourself or colleagues? So you mentioned maybe taking more breaks than usual. So it could be, I know when there's an increase in sick leave, that tends to be a bit of a red flag if it's kind of over a prolonged period of time. My mind goes to kind of coming in late and leaving early, and that kind of disengagement from work. But you also mentioned around maybe overworking or extended hours. So it could be that taking on more work, or is it that perhaps the tasks are taking longer because you're procrastinating or you're just not as engaged?
And I think it's a combination of both. I think it's that idea that you're trying to, you might find that there's workers who just think, I just need to keep doing more. So if I show up more, if I just do one more, if I just do one more visit, if I just do, if I just get those case notes right, if I try to show up more, they're trying to compensate for what they see as a lack in their professional ability. But then, like you say, there may also be that, as you become more overwhelmed, then just that simple cognitive process of thinking through your tasks and being able to clearly assess, well, what was my visit and what am I going to write into my notes, or what is it that I need to do to create this report. Those processes become more challenging because we are second guessing, and we're in that state of hyper arousal, which I think is often the case, is that people get to a point of such high agitation or hyper arousal that everything is on high alert, and the body cannot function in that way for a prolonged length of time. And I think that's one of the things about burnout. It's not actually about one-off critical incidents. It is about that chronic, prolonged exposure to multiple stresses in the workplace. So it might not be about your clients. It might be a combination of, the mix of your caseload, your support, the lack of resources in the community, the challenges of a team dynamic. These multiple workplace stresses that it's like comorbidity. They're all there together, and that repeated exposure and that lack of appropriate support to be able to psychologically and practically respond to these stresses takes its toll.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's
So I've kind of conceptualized stress and burnout as being slightly different. So for me, in my mind, and I'd love to hear your views on this, stress is kind of like there's a lot happening and there's a lot to do. But sometimes, often when it's that deadline or that project or whatever it is you're working on, once that's done, the stress kind of dissipates a little bit. But I kind of see burnout as being more just devoid of motivation, mentally exhausted. Like it's like you're drowning in responsibilities is more of a stress thing, but burnout is just like there's nothing left to give.
Yep. I think stress is good for us. We know that those points of stress, appropriate stress, is good for our body. It's good for our system. We develop those coping capacities. But what is important is that we have that capacity to come down from that. I think the perception of burnout, that it means that you lose that motivation whilst you're there, and becoming demotivated, was not my personal experience. But as I say, everybody's experiences are very different. Mine hit me like a brick wall. I literally felt the experience of breaking. I remember it vividly. It was the 9th of November. I had a team meeting that I had to run for my team, and I had to deliver more organizational decisions that I was struggled with myself. And on the way down to work, it was early morning, I'd thought, I'm going to just get a treat for the team. And I'd called into the shop, and the only place that was open was like a Kmart or somewhere. And all I could find was a tin of biscuits. And I'm like, that'll do. I'll take that down with me. And we delivered this meeting. And at some point in the meeting, a very trusted, very dear colleague made a comment about the wafers being stale. And I felt myself literally break. I snapped at her, like verbally, which is something that I would never do. I caused upset to her. I walked out of that meeting. I went upstairs, and I just sat there and I said, I am broken. And at that point, it all just went flooding out. I had nothing, literally had nothing left to give. But until that point, I had been pushing through, doing everything. I was there, I was determined, I was still doing. So I think for lots of people, they didn't see it coming. That was me. I was the high vibe, high alert manager. They didn't see it coming. But once I broke, that's when that idea of that complete overwhelm came. That idea that they had absolutely nothing left to give, the exhaustion. I couldn't take in a single bit more information. Um, and I remember when I look back on it, months before, I had stopped listening to the radio when I was driving to work. I'd stopped, I didn't watch any news. I was unable to take additional external stuff in. I just had to focus on getting to my job, switching on when I got out of the car to be that person that I needed to be, or I perceived I needed to be at work, getting through that day, and then coming home. And I was a mess at home. I was crying. I was very clear that things were not right, but I didn't have the word for it. I didn't know it was burnout. I really genuinely didn't. And I find that, for somebody who's been in the profession for, almost 20 years, I find that quite strange that I didn't realize what I was going through.
It doesn't surprise me that would be something that we just don't talk about.
Well, that's right. And I think for me, that's part of what now I'm not a practicing social worker, but I'm still a social worker. I had to release my identity as being a social worker for quite a while, because I had formed my sense of me around my professional identity. I was Helen, the social worker. And after I'd had my breakdown, I really had to release that. I really had to let go of that and say, okay, who am I now? Who am I if I'm not Helen, the social worker? And that was a real process of, self-exploration and learning. But as I've healed and as I've come through that, I'm very proud that I'm a social worker. I think that, what I've learned in the training and what we do as a profession is so vitally important that whilst I'm not a practicing social worker, I used to refer to myself as an ex-social worker, and now I come back to the fact that I am a social worker, and this is what I'm doing with that background. So, so I mean, I think that's, again, that's a change in how we go.
Yeah, so you also mentioned moral distress and vicarious trauma. What are they and how are they different to burnout?
Okay, so vicarious trauma, I think, is again something that there's a lot of emphasis on trauma-informed practice in our profession now, and understanding, adverse childhood experiences and the impact that may have on our clients, and starting to understand that as practitioners, we've also probably had our own experiences in our childhood. But vicarious trauma is something different. Vicarious trauma is something when we actually have an impact on ourselves from that repeated exposure to the traumatic material of our clients, and being alongside them as they're experiencing their traumatic experiences. And in many ways, I think it's a very natural and normal response, and I think that's what we need to be clear about, because we are absorbing and hearing and being part of this trauma, whilst we're not directly experiencing it ourselves. But the difference with vicarious trauma is that it starts to have an impact on the internal sort of like psyche, the worldview, the what I call the cognitive schema of the social worker. So that repeated exposure to traumatic material means that as a professional, your sense of self, your sense of identity, your sense of world norms and worldview starts to shift, and it's very subtle. And it's that sense that over time you gradually understand that your sense of normal, of reality, may be vastly different to other people. Again, for me, I had an experience. I went out with a group of girlfriends, and they're a mix. There's teachers, there's a dietitian, they're childcare, they're professional practitioners as well. And we were talking, and one of them just said to me, she just went, "Helen, we don't see the world that you see." And I was sort of like, "Oh." And they were just like, no, the way that you frame things, the way that you talk about things, we don't see the world that way. We don't see that part of the world. And I think that was an early indicator for me that my sense of normality had shifted. So I think with vicarious trauma, you get a sense of it in terms of it is a shifting in that sense of identity, that sense of self. It might be a questioning of your spirituality, whether that's religious or or wider spirituality, that sense of purpose. And again, it can manifest itself in different ways, like that idea of intrusive imagery, intrusive thoughts, hyper arousal, absolutely, hyper aroused to triggers about certain things. Again, it may be for some people avoidant behaviors, and again, that those changes in your cognition. For me, go on, sorry.
I was just going to say, how do you notice that in a person? So, you're looking at, you're constantly engaging with the client's trauma, and like you said, with your friends, like we don't see the world like others do. I mean, I remember my first placement in child protection. Like, we're seeing the pointiest of the pointy ends, and you're starting to maybe have a bit of a skewed view of the world as all families are like this, or you start to see kind of, because you don't see the happy family. They don't come to you because they don't need it. It's
That's
fine.
not the work that we do.
Yeah. So you're kind of exposed to this ongoing trauma, and then social workers, frontline workers, think emergency rescue workers, that kind of thing. But how do you have those conversations with someone? Like, how do you have them with colleagues? How do you put up boundaries with clients? Like, what do we do with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is where the importance of that clinical supervision plays a role. And unfortunately, whilst we have great supervision standards and all these things, in practice for many people in the field, quality clinical supervision is not the norm. Now, often we'll get line management or task supervision, but that idea of somebody being able to bring you back in, to shine a light on your perception, to ask you where that comes from and how that fits with reality, is really important. And again, I think it's we have to try and avoid collective group think in teams, because there can always be that sort of like that creeping. As a group, we believe that this is what we're going to get and this is the outcome. So we need to have that critical reflection process, actively running with our colleagues and within our supervision structures, so that we're able as individuals, and in supporting our colleagues, to come back down from those things. And I think that's we're not going to block our exposure to trauma. That's Otherwise we can't do our work. That's very clear. But what we need to be able to do is to find ways, collectively and individually, of being able to process that trauma through and coming back in. And I think in some of the fields, it's as simple as allowing people some, like a period of time in between visits to decompress, reflect, and compartmentalize some experiences. Just really practice that self-other separation, and be able to come back in and ground yourself, and ground yourself as, this is me and this is where I'm at, and what I've just experienced was over here, and that was the other, that wasn't me. But in the work that we do, and with the challenges of resources and time, many workers just don't get that. You come from one task to the next, one visit to the next, one client. If you're backing up clients back to back, and that is really important. And we just don't get that. So
how do you balance up the organisational responsibilities of providing that good quality supervision with also just personal responsibilities and ethics around, if my workplace isn't providing this, in order to be an effective practitioner, I need to source this out for myself, and I need to invest in either the time or the money, or attend a group practice or a group supervision? Like, how do you have those conversations with people where maybe your organisation doesn't do it this way, but that's no excuse? At some point, ethically, you need to be engaging in that good quality supervision, or you need to find those supports, because you can't do the work that you do. And it can be quite dangerous as well. Like, you can really, working with such vulnerable people, and we're in such a position of power and authority that they expect us to be there for them.
I think that is something that I've come to, having had my own experience. I think I don't think I was aware of that, or cognizant of the importance of that, throughout my practicing career. But I think it is vitally important. And I think, as when you're talking to students and new graduates, I actually think that they need to hold that baton of social work high, and be very clear about what is needed. If you're a doctor going in to do surgery, you're going to scrub your hands. You're going to spend 5 minutes thoroughly scrubbing your hands and your nails and everything else to make sure that you are clean to go in and do that surgery. As a social worker, before you go into that family, you need to be given the time, or you need to take the time to, have dusted off your previous client and be ready to go in to do your next task. And I think that I'm a strong believer that there is an organizational responsibility. And I think that in time to come, we will see consequences of the lack of that organizational follow through on the necessary support for our workers. But until that happens, I think that there is an onus on individuals to seek out the appropriate support, to get the needs met that they want. Um, I view now, having had my experience, I view self-care and this self-reflection and quality supervision. I view it akin to your seatbelt when you're driving a car. Um, you put that seatbelt on every day when you're driving a car, and you wouldn't drive a car these days without your seatbelt on, because one day, if the unexpected or the unforeseen happens, that's going to stop you from going through the window screen. And I think that we need to look at our self-care and our supervision and our reflection practices as our daily seatbelt. We don't know when the unexpected is going to hit us. We don't know when the accumulation of all the stuff that we've experienced in our work is going to suddenly, come to the fore. We need to have, our daily supports. And that is, that's a combination of what we can do ourselves, but also what we might need to outsource to, either a collective group or private, clinical supervision if we can. I guess if we can just go back and to the idea of moral distress, I think, just for a little bit, because I think this is something that I think when we're as social workers, we spend our time, we train ourselves to look at the situation, look at every situation, from different angles, consider, what's happening. We're quite different to other professions. Doctors, they have a very clear medical model. Different practitioners have a very clear focus. As social workers, we have that holistic, view of looking at, both the individual and society and the systems and the structures. We look at things from more than that single view. And when we talk about moral resiliency, that's when we, as we go on through our profession, we learn through all of these ethical, moral dilemmas that we have about how to take action, and that's what makes us stronger and makes us able to balance, the moralities of our views and our values with that of the world and society. For me, moral distress is a very specific aspect where what is the right thing to do. You've come to that opinion, that informed opinion. It's not a question of what's right. You've got a belief that you know what's the right thing to do, but you're prevented from taking that action because of, the institutional or the situational constraints. So it might be resources, it might be funding, it might be time. And then there is a consequence because of that. And for it to be actually moral distressing for the individual, you actually then have to have a physiological or a psychological response to that. So when we're working, some of these moral distress situations, they may be, I think as social workers, I think these are more significant situations than just everyday occurrences, because as I say, we're used to dealing with moral dilemmas and ethical choices and how to balance that. But the moral distress is when something should have happened and it hasn't. You've not been able to enact it. And therefore, the moral residue is the continual impact of that, because often it's to do with clients, because as social workers, that's what where we're trying to get the good to occur. So often we then see the continual impact of not being able to act on a certain decision. And it may be that it's, in the life of a child, it may be it's in a family situation. And that starts to have that eating away, that ongoing sort of like emotional impact on us. And in order for us to be able to manage these things, then that's where we do need to have both an awareness about what it is that we're experiencing, a knowledge about what theories, what ideas, what strategies can help, and tools to actually put it into practice. And I think sometimes we do have, in some cases we do have the knowledge and the skills, but we might not have the time or the capacity to put it into place. And that comes back to what you're saying, is that, we maybe need to start taking onus of that and taking responsibility of that, to say, this is something I need to put into place before it impacts my work with clients, not when it's impacting my work with clients. So that we're proactive in our support for our sort of like professional future.
Yeah, wonderful. And I mean, a few episodes ago, I did an episode around boundary setting, and I think that's a really important one as well, because if you don't have that good quality supervision, and I think line management, it's not that those people aren't often able to do it, but when you're working with someone where you don't feel like there's a pressure to perform, and you don't feel that they're also in charge of maybe performance or caseload management, that kind of thing, you can really have these more deep, robust conversations. And it's really hard to kind of see if your boundaries are being blurred, if there is a little bit of burnout, if that kind of fatigue is creeping in, because you're often a little bit more on show when it's line management.
Yeah.
And you can't dig in as deeper, and you maybe feel a little bit too vulnerable to actually say, because then there's a different power dynamic there as well.
And I think that, obviously the power dynamic in line management supervision, but also for a lot of social workers, we're working in multidisciplinary teams. So we're working alongside people who aren't social workers. And in many cases, we're being managed by people who aren't social workers. And that doesn't mean that, you know, they are not equipped to manage us, but it does mean that potentially their perception and their priorities of what are the important things and the issues may be slightly different. And I just think that idea of that clinical supervision is really important to help bring things together. I do have to say that in the organization where I had my breakdown, I actually had probably, the most support in terms of I had clinical supervision than I'd had throughout my career. And I think that's where it becomes, it's accumulation effect. It is not just, what's happening at that moment in time. I throw back to my time in Northern Ireland. I had line manager supervision, but we didn't have clinical supervision. The things that I experienced, the like many early social workers, there's certain things that stay with you, um, and I don't think that at the time in that we're in a different era now, but I don't think back then that there was the the support and the processing of these things and the insight into the impact of on the worker of exposure and having to make those decisions in these circumstances. So I often described my burnout as um, and as I was taught, or maybe I wasn't taught, but I quickly assumed the idea of a protective wall. And what I did with my protective wall, rather than trying to let things in, was, I chucked things over my protective wall, so they didn't come in, they didn't affect me, or so I thought. And when I had my breakdown, it was almost as if that skip that had been catching all those things that I had over the years had thrown over came flooding out. And I think that's because if we don't actually process and work through those experiences, then they linger and there is some effect of it. So, my message is very clear that burnout is not inevitable. It is not something that should or is going to happen to everybody. But if we don't take the action to support ourselves, then it's highly likely.
And I found it interesting what you said earlier about it. Sometimes it's not just one big incident, it's an accumulation of lots of little ones. And I'm pretty sure, I think there was a recent OH&S report looking at that same concept of it's not just one big event that's causing workplace absenteeism. Often it's those small little things, almost like death by a thousand paper cuts. So it's not that one big client incident, but it could be the 10th, the 100th, it could be in your second year, it could be in your 12th year. Like they can happen slowly over time. And then maybe there's something else that happens that exacerbates it. And like you said, it all just comes flooding out.
That's right. And I think that is, I think it's that accumulation, it's that not having processed and supported those things over time, that they just build, that they sit there latent and something triggers it and they come to the fore. And sometimes sometimes that happens and you bounce back and you keep going, and then sometimes it might be that is the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah, so tell me about the Because You Care program.
Okay, so look, this is something that I've developed specifically because of what we've been talking about. I realized that after my breakdown, I went through a period of an intense period of self recovery, and that was about really like tuning into myself, reconnecting with my values and my sense of identity, relearning a lot of my beliefs and my coping strategies because I'd become dependent on ones which had got me to where they'd got me. Um, and I also then, as I was healing and as I was feeling better, I wanted to understand why. There was a part of me that just said, well, what is it? What is it that, what is it that made you get to this point? So I did some additional training myself. I did some training with a Canadian mental health social worker who specializes in compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. And that was a professional training program where we went through an understanding of the information and the resources for ourselves as individuals, but then also how could we then impart this information and how could we share this learning out to others to raise awareness and to get, more focus on the importance of the program, as she calls it, was caring safely. So I was really keen to look at a way of supporting practicing social workers. I was also very keen that it was for the individual and didn't become something that was just another organizational tick chart. We know that we go to training days, and yes, they're very useful, but we come back and, we get straight back into it, and we often don't take a lot of that stuff back with us. So I wanted to create a program where the individual actually had a space and time and safety to explore their own situation and some of the things around that, to get perspective, so to raise awareness, to get more knowledge, and to develop some of the skills to support themselves as they keep doing the work. So Because You Care is an 8-week program. It is broken into 4 modules that are released fortnightly. And the idea is that I use video training, wider resources, self-reflection processes, practical skill implementation to support the participants to work through some key areas. So we start with module 1 is about resetting your moral compass. And that is really about delving back into your values, your beliefs, the rewards that you get from the work that you do, and also exploring, the concepts of self-compassion and gratitude. Module 2 is more focused on mindset and the organizational context. So how you process things, what your attitudes are, what you're influenced by in terms of the organization that you're trying to practice in. Module 3 is very much about the mind-body connection. It's really about understanding our emotions, our response, our trauma response, which is a natural trauma response, and being able to be responsive and attuned to our own individual needs. And then the final module is about bringing it all together and looking at professional sustainability and really being clear about what you as an individual need. And this comes back to, how are you going to move forward with this information? Are you going to make choices about the work environment that you're in? Are you going to make choices to access the support that you're not getting? What are you going to do to create a wellness and a career path that is sustainable going forward?
Wonderful. And they're all online modules that people can do self-paced?
They're all online modules, yeah, that they can do through a 24/7 training interface.
Great. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. You've also got a professional quality of life self-assessment. So for the listeners out there, they can go to your website. So that's Helen Gray, and Gray spelled GRAY.com.au, to get that self-assessment. So what do they come away with after that self-assessment?
So the professional quality of life assessment is an existing scale which looks at, I think it's 30 questions that you go through, and it looks at basically your levels of compassion satisfaction, vicarious trauma, and burnout. So it gives you an indication of your risk levels. Now, obviously, it's about raising awareness, and I think that that's the important thing. Just doing the assessment is not going to protect you. But doing the assessment may just, raise some awareness in you of some areas, or give you, thought about what you need to do. And from there, it is then about looking, well, what is it that I need? Where do I get my support? How do I need to take action to ensure that I'm putting my well-being first? Because, there's a saying which I absolutely love, and it is that you actually give from the overflow of your cup, not from what's in your cup. Because what's in your cup is yours. The overflow of that is what you give to other people. And I think, as social workers, we are so good at giving of ourselves to our job and to our, the people that we care about. And there's a natural, we've been taught to be compassionate and empathetic, and that's what we do. But you can't do it at the expense of your own well-being. And I learned that the hard way. I thought that I was doing the right thing, and actually I was doing harm to myself and to my relationships, and to, in the end, I left a team completely unsupported because I couldn't be there anymore. So I did the thing that I, never wanted to do, that I'd been fighting not to do, is actually the result. I became a client of the system. And when you look at that, that's madness, that I let myself get to that point. So it's very much about trying to, help people get awareness of where they're at. And there's more resources, as we say, on my website to then, take things a little bit further.
Yeah, thank you. And you also have a recording of a webinar that people can access. Can you tell me a bit about what's in that and where people can listen to it or
Sure.
watch it?
Yeah, so again, there's a download link through my website. It's called At What Cost? How to Thrive as a Social Worker Without Putting Your Wellbeing at Risk. And it goes into a little bit more detail about the ideas of vicarious trauma, moral distress, and burnout. It looks at some very simple strategies, and it's just really, again, another way for you to take a bit of time to reflect on your situation and learn some of the information behind, and maybe put some names and some terms and some concepts behind what it is you're experiencing. I remember that being quite liberating when I actually did the work with Charlene Richardson, the Canadian mental health social worker, and I was like, oh, I fit a model, and it suddenly made sense. So it's important that we know that we are not, it's not you as the individual that's going through this alone. It actually is a very collective experience, but we need to take that appropriate preventative action.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And just to wrap up, what are some tools or resources that you can recommend to maybe students who are kind of doing their final placements and are finding that this is a topic that's of interest to them, and sort of graduate early career social workers?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that for students, I think one of the most important things that they can do for themselves is actually to put self-care in the same bracket as their other practice principles. So in terms of that they're going to make ethically informed decisions, and that they're going to carry out their practice with that correct intent, and use evidence-based research, they need to be putting their self-care at that level. It is not something that is an afterthought. Like we say about the seatbelt, it's not an afterthought. There's no point putting your seatbelt on when you've crashed the car. So I just think that, and I also really encourage them to not fall into the trap. And this comes for those early year social workers as well. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that the people who have been there longer have got it right, because a lot of us haven't. Just because somebody's been there 10 years, and just because they might be a little bit cynical about group supervision, or doing another peer review of something, it doesn't mean that that's not right. So we as a new breed of social workers, you're almost laying the foundations for a change. We need to change the rhetoric. We don't actually, our lot is not to have to work too long with too few resources. The system might be pretty well broken in most places, but it doesn't mean that as social workers you need to break within it as well. So I send the rally call out to champion them to be the caretakers of their own well-being, because if we as practitioners don't look after ourselves, we can't look after other people.
That's so beautifully said. And thank you so much. This has been such an honest conversation, and you've shared, the challenges that you face, as well as, I guess, the other side of that, the resources that you had to put in place, the learning and the growth that you had to do, and to turn that also into something that can help other people. So I thank you so much for your knowledge and wisdom on this topic.
No, thank you so much for the opportunity. As I say, I mean, I think, my new vocation now is to support other people to do the work, and I'm loving that. I'm loving every moment of it. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening. I hope you found this episode interesting and insightful. Burnout and self-care is a topic that's come up a lot in other podcast episodes, and it's been something that's been requested. People have reached out to me on social media and added this as a topic they wanted to hear a bit more about. So head over to the show notes. You'll find a link to Helen Gray's webinar and to the Save Our Social Workers course, and a whole bunch of other stuff there. And just a reminder, if you enjoyed the podcast, please rate us and review us wherever it is you get your podcast.